right, well, good evening. Welcome to our series on church history. We're going to do this in 3 different sessions, 2 hours each session. And everyone should have a handout, and on the back of the handout is the assignment. And for those watching online, I think I have it on the first slide. You can look to receive the handouts. You can contact Eric Deedle, or at the end of those handouts also is the assignment if you're doing this for intermediate life credit. And then you can submit your 1 to 2 page write-up to Eric at this email address at the edeedle@thecathedral.info. And so again, I'll remind you about this at the end of the series as well. But for those taking intermediate life credit, that will apply to you. All right, so we'll get started on church history, and we're going to have to cover about 2,000 years over the next few nights, and so in less than 6 hours. So we're going to really largely do some generalizations. I'm not going to be able to cover everything that happens, but we're going to try to cover some of the most important events and some other key things that happened during this time. And so sometimes I'll have to make generalizations, and sometimes I won't be able to go into specific details about certain events, but hopefully we can start to really get a sense for what's happened over these past 2,000 years. But to get started, when we talk about history, we have to think that history is an ongoing story, and it's a story that we're all a part of, and it's an ongoing drama of good and evil. And by understanding history, we can better understand our own story and our own identity, who we are. But one of the things we have to be cautious with when we look back at history is that we can't make the mistake of seeing history as inevitably going from a less perfect world to a more perfect world, or going from times of ignorance to times of more intelligence. In some areas, we can increase our knowledge and understanding, such as with technology and in areas of science. But when it comes to things like morality, we don't necessarily increase our knowledge in the same way. And even when we do increase our knowledge, such as with technology and science, it doesn't always mean that we're making the world a better place necessarily. And so we have to be careful to not see history as going from a time of barbarism to a time of utopia, and that we're getting closer and closer to heaven here on earth. There's only one heaven, and what we can try to do is make this world a better place and try to transform our culture and our society, but we're never going to be able to make everything perfect here and eliminate all poverty and all sickness and all sin. And when we look at history, we have to recognize that the most important event of history has already happened. And that was at the Incarnation, when God became man because of love for humanity and then died on the cross to redeem the human race. This was the turning point of our history. So when we look at history in general, we have to see this is the central point, and then we can see things that happened before that time and since that time, but we have to always keep this in context. And when we look at history, we also have to keep in mind that some of the most important things are part of the spiritual realm and not part of the material world that we can see. It doesn't mean that stuff doesn't matter. I mean, stuff matters. The material things, the material world is very important. It's part of God's creation, but we can't stop there. There's also a spiritual reality as well, which includes God and the angels and the demons, and they all play a part in our history. And when we look at history, we also have to recognize the reality of sin. Sin is a reality, and it's always going to exist in this earthly life. When each of us cooperate with grace, we can have deeper and deeper conversions and hopefully try to be less dominated by sin, but we'll never be able to eliminate it completely. And so because we have to realize the reality of sin, when we look at history, we have to always understand that that's at play. That all the different people that we're going to talk about, they all have their own personalities, they all have their own character, and they all are sinners like all of us. And so sometimes they make mistakes. Sometimes they do things that are sinful or immoral. And sometimes we'll see even conflicts between different personalities and different characters, because that's reality. And as I mentioned, it is possible for society to become more cruel, just as it's possible for it to become less cruel. And it's also possible for society to become more just. It's also possible that it could become less just. So we'll see this over time. When we look at history, we have to keep that in mind. And then one of the other most important things when we look at history is we have to always remember God and his providence. That God is personal. He has intervened most perfectly at the incarnation, but God continues to intervene in our own lives and in history. And in God's providence, it's always at play. So when we look, oftentimes we can't see it acutely. Sometimes we overlook or miss the providence, God's providence at work in our own lives acutely. But when we look back and step back, we can start to see God's hand at work. And so when we look at history, we want to look for those things as well. And then the final thing to touch on about history is that when Christ came, he also established his church. And his church is a visible institution, a visible thing that he gave us. And he put this, it's part of his earthly kingdom. It's not simply a collection of ideas or simply a creed or simply an invisible group of just Christian believers. It's a city on a hill. It's a sign for the world. It's to be a light in the world of darkness. It's to help influence our lives. The church is God's gift to help lead us closer to him, to be a source of grace and source of truth. And so we always have to look at history and look at the church's role throughout history as well, because the church is intimately united to Christ. It's his body. And so we have to also keep in mind the church when we look at history. And the church, as Christ, when Christ was on earth, he gave his church the mission to go out and spread the gospel, to spread the truth about Christ and about God. And Christ warned the church that your mission is to share the truth with love, but often these truths are going to be countercultural, and as a result, you're going to be hated and persecuted at times, more often than not. And we even see this from the very beginning, and Christ warned the church, if they persecute me, they'll persecute you. And so the church is Christ's instrument in the world, and so when we look at history, we can't ignore the reality of the church and the role that she plays. And so over the next several hours, as we look back over the past 2,000 years, we're going to look at history, and specifically looking at history through the eyes of the church and looking at the church and seeing what all was happening, keeping the church and Christ as central to our perspective on history. And as I mentioned, it's going to be 2,000 years, so we're going to have to make some generalizations at times and sometimes not be able to cover every event that's happened, but hopefully we can start to begin to see a good overview of the past 2,000 years and allow that to help us learn from history and see what it is that we can continue to do today to transform our own lives and our own culture and the world. And to get started, when we look at history, there's some historians, and this is a generalization, but there's some historians, particularly secular historians, who look at history and they'll divide history into three parts. The ancient world, which largely is the Greco-Roman world, that time before Christ. And they'll say that this was a world that was a time of intelligence. We can see that they were building cities, they were building aqueducts, they were very innovative. There was a lot of writing, great source of signs of intellect, great culture. And then they'll say the second part of history is what's called the Dark Ages. And they'll describe this as a time from the time of Christ for the next hundreds of years. They'll call that the Dark Ages. And they'll say this is a time when the Christians are coming into a larger influence, and they're going to eventually convert the Roman Empire so that the Roman Empire becomes Christian. And this is a time when the Christians will darken civilization, and they will not allow people to think for themselves. And it's a time when there's a lot of myths and lies that are being spread. And so some will say this is why it's called the Dark Ages, because it was a time of darkness. Now the reality is completely different, as we'll show, but this is what you may hear from some people when they talk about history. And then the final phase that some historians will describe is what's called the Enlightenment. And this is a time when they'll say this is a time when light was brought back into the world, because it was a time when they were able to suppress Christianity and Christian ideas and allow people to think for themselves. They were able to bring reason and wisdom back. And so people again were now able to be enlightened in a sense. And so it was a time of enlightenment. And again, as I mentioned, this isn't what really happened, but sometimes you may hear this kind of portrayal of this time period. But what I'm going to do over the next several hours is use a division by a historian. His name's Christopher Dawson. And I'm going to use the way that he has divided history. And he's divided history into 6 parts, 6 divisions. And the first part is the Apostolic Age, the first 3 centuries. And this is a time when Christianity was born and was given the mission to evangelize the world. And there's a great flourishing of Christianity. We see many great writers, the church fathers, who are defending the faith. And it's a time when we also see a lot of martyrs, a lot of people who are dying for their Christian faith, for Christ. The second age is called the Patristic Age. It's from around 300 to 650 AD. And this is a time when the Emperor of Rome will eventually convert to Christianity, and you'll have Christianity made the official religion of the empire in the late 4th century. And then, because the empire becomes Christian, it's going to bring many challenges for the church. There's some good things, some benefits to this, but there's also challenges. And it's also going to be a time where we see the rise of heresies, barbarism, the invasion of the barbarians, and then also a time with the monks, the monasticism. And we'll talk about each of these ages in more detail. And then the third age is called the Carolingian Age, from 650 to 1000. And this the name is given by the key figure during this time, who is Charlemagne. And he's the emperor of the Frankish kingdom. And he's going to do much to help unify the western part of the empire. Barbarians will continue to invade. And you also have the invasions of the Muslims and Vikings and Magyars. There's also a time when the Western Empire falls into a lot of chaos and disunity. And we'll talk about that. The church will send out a lot of missionaries during this time, particularly sending out the monks. And then the fourth period is the High Middle Ages, from 1000 to 1500. This is a time when the church, who has been influenced a lot by some of the chaos and disunity from a political and economic standpoint, from the invasions of the barbarians, will really start to try to make many reforms in all areas of her life. And we're going to see the first several hundred years a time of great reform, eventually a time of great flourishing during the first half of the High Middle Ages. And then we're going to start to see in the later half some more troubles that will arise within the church. The fifth age is the Baroque age, from the 1500s to the 1800s, and at the beginning of this we'll see the Protestant Reformation, and I put that in quotes. It's really more of a revolt, so a Protestant revolt from the church, where you'll have many people start to revolt from the church and then lead to many, many divisions within Christianity. And what we'll see is the first 150 years of this age is largely going to involve religious wars, a lot of fighting between Catholic countries and Protestant countries, and then the Protestants will also fight among themselves. And there's both religious as well as secular motivations tied into this. And then after this time period, because there's so much difficulty with religion, people are going to start to try to find truth without religion. And you're going to see the rise of many ideologies. They're going to see that religion just causes war and fighting and problems. And so they're going to bracket religion and start to look for truth in other ways. So a lot of ideologies will start to come into play. And then the last period is the modern age, from 1800 to present. So we'll cover these ages briefly over the next several hours. But we'll jump right in and get started with the first age, which is the Apostolic Age. So the first 3 centuries of the church. St. Paul in his writings tells us that Christ came in the fullness of time. So when he says that, what does he mean by fullness of time? What Paul is indicating is that in God's providence, Christ came at the right place, at the right time, on purpose, by design, at a particular moment in history. It wasn't by chance or coincidence. It was all a part of God's providence. And we can look back at history, just in our Judeo-Christian history, and recognize the many ways that God had prepared the Jewish people for the coming of the Messiah. And God had showed the Israelites his love and mercy. and had helped the Israelites to see the reality of their sinfulness and their need for God's help, for God's grace. And so when Christ came, he came and fulfilled all that had been prophesied to the Jews. He fulfilled their practices and their feasts. The laws were fulfilled. He came and showed the Jewish people what it was God was fully calling them to do and to be. And so Christianity is this fulfillment of Judaism. But Christ did not just come in the fullness of time for the Jewish people. In many ways, in God's providence, Christ also came at a time when he was coming to fulfill much of what the Greco-Roman culture was seeking and searching for. And so in a sense, in the fullness of time, for the Greco-Roman culture as well. And this was the culture of majority of the known world. And so what Christ will do is he's going to fulfill many of their longings and desires. So in the Greco-Roman culture at the time, many of the they were pagans largely, but there were some who started to believe there was a higher power, a supreme being. And then there were others who believed there were many supreme beings, many gods, these mythological gods. So you have different types of camps and different types of views. Some believed in no supreme being, but most people believed either there was multiple gods, mythological gods, or there was one supreme being. But they still had a lot of confusion and questions about this. Many of those who believed in the mythological gods would even rely on magic or rituals to try to get these gods to influence our world. And so they wanted the gods to influence natural things. They believed that was possible. And then there were others who really didn't believe these mythological gods were real, but they still believed there was some power who could influence this world. They just didn't quite comprehend it. We also see them searching for truth. They're searching for understanding of some of the deeper things of life. Cicero is a perfect example of one of the philosophers, the Greco-Roman philosophers at the time, who came to believe there is a supreme being, but he really just didn't believe that there was a way we could know more about this supreme being. And he even said that there's no way we can find God unless he would dare to speak to us and reveal himself to us. But Cicero never thought this would happen. He didn't think this supreme being, this God, was personal. Cicero had come to believe there is likely life after death, and he kind of developed this belief after the death of his son. So he believed there is life after death, he just didn't really understand it, and he didn't really have any way to find the answers to his questions. He didn't understand how to explain why evil exists or why there's injustice and sickness in the world, and so he often just avoided these questions because he wasn't really sure. And so what we'll see is that when Christ comes, what is he showing the Greco-Roman culture? He's answering their questions. He's going to bring the fullness of truth. He's going to show them answers to all these questions they'd been longing to know. So when they search for this higher power who can intervene in our world and who can influence our lives, Christ shows them about the one true God. And Christ works miracles. He shows that he has power over the demons through exorcism. He has power over the natural world when he calms the storms. He can heal the sick. He can raise the dead. So he's showing not only the Jewish people, but also the Greco-Roman people that he has the answers to their questions about this supreme being. They're seeking their desire to understand about life after death, about evil and injustice and sickness. Christ shows them he has the answers. And as I mentioned, when Cicero felt that the only way we could come to know God was if he spoke to us or revealed himself to us, Christ shows us this is exactly what God is doing. God is speaking to us, and he is revealing himself to us, and most perfectly through Christ himself. And so Christ is showing us that God is a personal God, and he does intervene in our world. And so in many ways, Christ comes in the fullness of time for both from a Jewish perspective and a Greco-Roman perspective. Now, when we look at history, this apostolic age, one of the first things I want to start with is just looking at the life of the early Christian communities. What was it that they focused on? And what were some of the things they held to be important? We can see much of this in the Gospels and the New Testament, as well as in the early church fathers and their writings. But what we see is that in the early Christian communities, they saw themselves as a community. There wasn't individualism. It wasn't about me, myself, and I didn't only care about myself. There was this community, a strong emphasis on community, loving one another, caring for each other. You know, when one suffers, we all suffer. When one rejoices, we all rejoice. There's also an understanding that Christ had told us that his church would be with sheep and goats, with wheat and weeds. We would all be a part of his church together. And so what would happen is sometimes if maybe even one of the leaders of the church, whether it was a priest or a bishop, or even one of the lay people, if someone did something immoral or sinful, they didn't fall into despair, thinking the church was now going astray. They understood the church was holy because of Christ, and that Christ protected his church, but that within Christ's church were sinners, and that sometimes there would be things that would happen among all people in the church, even her leaders. Their life was centered on the sacraments. We can see that in the Acts of the Apostles especially. They recognized the church was a visible organization. The church was one body with many members. There was a hierarchy. There was order. It was very important for the church to have leaders to help protect unity and to help protect truth. Everyone had a role to play. It wasn't that the leaders held this over the others. It was all service. All the leaders understood they were there for the service of everyone else, but they knew they needed leaders to protect the unity and to protect the truth and preserve the members of the church from falling into heresy. They recognized that their mission was to be a sign of contradiction to the world. They were to be countercultural. And they also recognized the importance of history and tradition. And they also had a social teaching. We'll talk more about that here in just a little bit. But they understood that we had to care for one another. Every single person has equal human dignity, and life is sacred. They understood solidarity, caring for each other. You're responsible for each other. They also recognized that your faith had to be lived. It could not simply be something superficial. In order to be authentic, it had to be a faith that was lived out every day. And then they also understood the kingdom was yet to come. They were on a journey. They didn't expect to create a utopia here on earth. They knew that they were on a journey to heaven. And they also recognized they all had a mission. Every single baptized person had a mission of holiness and evangelization. They were to always strive for holiness, and they were to evangelize and share Christ and the gospel with everyone they could. So these were some of the things they held to be very important, and it would influence their lives each and every day. It influences how they lived and what they held to be sacred. And one of the things that we can do to see this is in a writing called the Didache that was in the 1st century. There's a quote that I think really helps to show us their mindset at the time. And in the Didache it says, "There are 2 ways, one of life and one of death, but a great difference between the 2 ways. The way of life then is this: first you shall love God who made you. Second, love your neighbor as yourself, and do not do to another what you would not want done to you. And of these sayings the teaching is this: bless those who curse you, pray for your enemies, and fast for those who persecute you." So you can see the emphasis of understanding the reality that there are 2 ways, and in order to get to heaven we need to love God and love our neighbor. And you can see, especially in this last line, some of their mentality, because we know from history, and we'll talk about this moment and briefly, they're about to be persecuted. Many of these Christians are about to be persecuted, many even killed for their faith, but they're understanding that they're supposed to bless those who curse them. They're supposed to pray for their enemies, and they're supposed to fast for those who persecute you. Their focus is not revenge and rising up in any way other than rising up with the truth, with prayer, and with fasting. And then St. Augustine writes this. It's later than this time period. It's in the 400s. But he also writes something that I think this quote could easily be applied to this early community. St. Augustine wrote, convert those who do not believe with an example of your life, so that your faith has a motive. If God's word pleases you, act accordingly. Not only God's word in your heart, but in your life, so that you will form God's family, united and pleasing to his eyes in all your actions. Don't doubt, brethren, that if your lives are worthy of God, unbelievers will find faith. And I think this is just a beautiful quote that really shows, this early church understood the importance of witness with their lives. They understood the importance of using words as well as their own life and how they lived. If they would preach one thing but live another way, they understood it was hypocritical, but they also understood that in their own lives, as they're witnessing to the truth, they also have to, at times, use words and preach and explain what it is that God teaches us. And so they understood these things in the early church. Now, some of the conflicts the Christians are going to experience during these first few centuries, the first is going to be with the Jewish people. So the Jewish people were waiting for the Messiah, but their understanding of the Messiah was different than how it ultimately ended up being. Many of the Jewish people thought the Messiah was going to come and be a dominant force in the world, that he was going to vindicate the Jewish people, and then they'd see the pagans punished, and they'd see their Messiah come and be a king in this world, an earthly king, and he would basically help to conquer the Greco-Roman people who were persecuting the Jews. And so they saw that this Messiah would establish a physical kingdom. But these Christians, when they started preaching, were preaching the Messiah had come. But they were saying that the Messiah was a man who was born in a manger, lived in the town of Nazareth, and then he was crucified as a criminal by the Romans. And then worse than this, they even said that this man was God. They claimed that this man who was crucified as a criminal was God. The Jewish people saw this as blasphemy. They also saw that the Christians were teaching that you no longer needed to worship in the temple in Jerusalem. You no longer needed the Jewish priesthood nor the animal sacrifices. You didn't have to follow the Mosaic law. And many of the feasts and festivals no longer had to be celebrated. And you didn't even have to be circumcised anymore. The Jewish people saw all these things as blasphemy. And to the Jewish people, for the past 400 more years prior to this time, they had been dying for their own faith. And at the end of the Old Testament, in the letters to the Maccabees, 1st and 2nd Maccabees, you can see the Jewish people being martyred for their faith. They're being killed because they refuse to deny God. They refuse to not practice the Mosaic law. And so many were giving their lives for the Jewish faith. So now they see this group of people, these Christians, proclaiming blasphemy. And so the Jewish people in many cases were very upset. We can even see this in St. Paul. At the very beginning, he is persecuting the Christians, arresting them, imprisoning them, and even consenting to their murder in many cases because he thinks they're preaching blasphemy. So the Jewish people are having problems with the Christians. From the Roman perspective, won't get there yet. The Romans see that the Christians are undermining their entire worldview. Many of the things the Christians are preaching are countercultural. They're turning the world upside down. And so the Romans are, in many ways, kind of bothered by the Christians and what it is that they're preaching. Some of the things that they'll preach that make the Romans a little bit baffled in many ways is the idea of humility. The Christians preach that humility is a virtue. This is the idea that you put others above yourself. And so to the Romans, this was something they had not really ever focused on as a virtue. So in a sense, it was a new virtue, because to the Romans, my job was to make myself the best person I could be, to form my entire being, and then contribute to society. And then I could be successful and happy. It wasn't necessarily, there wasn't a focus on me putting others above myself. It was, how can I make myself the best person and then contribute to society? So humility wasn't something that was really focused on. It was really a new virtue that the Christians were promoting. This idea of patience, and this is meant in the kind of more classical sense that it means enduring suffering. The Romans were shocked by this idea, because to them it was, we need to avoid suffering. We don't necessarily need to endure it. But there was this idea of redemptive suffering, this idea of patience and enduring that suffering, which was, again, a new virtue that was new to the Romans. This idea of detachment from the world. And some philosophers may have understood this, but there were also others who didn't really understand this Christian idea of detachment from the world. But all the philosophers would not have understood that our goal is the next life and not this life. That it was more honorable in many ways to die for God and give up everything in this life. They thought that was just very shocking. There's also equal rights that the Christians promoted, so equal rights for women, for slaves. This was not something that was promoted in the Greco-Roman culture. Other things that were promoted by the Christians that was kind of countercultural was monogamy. The Christians preached against divorce, against contraception, against abortion. And they also preached monotheism. There's only one God, and he's a personal God. This was very countercultural because the Romans believed in many gods, and they allowed people to believe however they chose. The biggest thing at this time was that there was an emperor, and you needed to worship him as God, and then you could believe in whatever other gods you wanted. But the majority worshipped multiple gods. And then one of the things we also have to understand about this time period was just the situation with the emperor. And so in the Roman Empire, they were ruled by an emperor, by Caesar. And Julius Caesar was the first who tried to become the sole ruler of the Roman Empire, but he was assassinated. And so what ends up happening is his adopted son, Octavian, became his heir as leader, as one of the leaders. And so Octavian changed his name to Caesar Augustus. And then Caesar Augustus had a good relationship with the Senate, and he really gained their trust to the point where he eventually was promoted to be sole leader, the king, the emperor of the entire Roman Empire. And so Caesar Augustus, because of his relationship with the Senate, also promoted the idea that his adopted father, Julius Caesar, was a god. So he wanted the Senate to say that Julius Caesar, who had died, was a god. So he promoted this among the Senate. They eventually approved this. And so posthumously, Julius Caesar is deified. So he's made a god. So Caesar Augustus then, once this is declared, says, okay, good, he's a god. Now I'm the son of God. And because I'm in his line, I'm also God. And so Caesar Augustus starts to really promote the idea of emperor worship. One of the things Caesar Augustus also does is that he has someone write a gospel of Caesar Augustus to talk about his life and to announce his birth, to talk about his coronation, to spread the good news of things that Caesar Augustus was bringing to the empire. And so the idea of the gospel or evangelium already existed, but he kind of promotes it now to be about his own life. The evangelium, the good news of the life of Caesar Augustus. Within this, he also talks about how Caesar Augustus was the bringer of peace, the savior of the world, the Son of God, and that he was Lord and God. Caesar Augustus also has what's called the Acts of Caesar Augustus that were written about the great deeds that he did, his victories in war, all the great accomplishments that he did. And so these were existing at that time in the Roman Empire. So what we can then see is when the Christians start to preach about Jesus, they too write gospels. They write gospels of Jesus Christ. St. Mark in his gospel, the very first line is almost exactly the lines that you read at the beginning of the Gospel of Caesar Augustus. And then they also have written the Acts of the Apostles. And this is all trying to undermine what it is that Caesar is promoting. And Caesar had made it illegal to use the term to call anyone else God but himself or those who had died. It was illegal to call anyone else the Savior of the world or the bringer of peace or the Son of God except for Caesar. And so the Christians, because they recognize that this is not the truth when they're teaching about Christ, they undermine what it is that Caesar is promoting, and they start to teach that Jesus is God, Jesus is the Savior of the world, Jesus is the bringer of peace, Jesus is the true Son of God. And so they are attacking Caesar and everything that it is that he is preaching and teaching. And this is illegal, but they're being bold and courageous because it's the truth. And so they're being very subversive, countercultural, And they're confronting all the things that the pagans, this Greco-Roman culture, held to be true. And so in the New Testament, we can see this happening time and time again. Even when Paul writes to the Romans, the people who live in the capital of the Roman Empire, he's using this language to really be subversive to what it is that Caesar is preaching and teaching. The other thing that the Romans, that we have to understand about the Romans and their relationship with the Christians, is that the Romans at first don't see the Christians as a threat, because the Romans at first just think the Christians are this Jewish sect, just this little branch off the Jewish religion. And so at first they're not too concerned about them. One of the things we have to recognize too about the Jewish people's relationship with the Roman Empire, so we can understand how this all interplays, is that the Jews were a very small group of people who primarily lived in the region of Palestine. And then there were a few that were scattered throughout the empire, but for the most part, it was a small group. And so because the Roman Empire, you're required to worship Caesar as a god, the Jewish people continue to refuse to do that. And so ultimately what will happen is, because they don't want any riots or protesting, the Romans will make the Jews an exception. They'll say, well, listen, this small little group of people who live primarily in this region of Palestine, they don't evangelize. They're not trying to actively spread their faith. They refuse to worship the way that we do, so we'll give them an exception. They can worship their own God, the one God that they worship, and they won't be required to worship the emperor or the other Roman gods, so we'll make an exception for them. So they never had to be forced to worship the Caesar, the Roman emperor, at this point in time, at the time of Christ. And so whenever the Christians start coming about, the Romans think they're another Jewish sect. So at first the Christians have this same exemption. They also aren't forced to worship the emperor at first because they think that they're Jews. But what the Romans start to see is that there's something different about the Christians than about the Jews. And the difference is that the Christians are actively evangelizing. They're actively trying to spread their faith and all the teachings about Christ. And this is very disturbing for the Romans, because this was different than the Jews. The Jews really were content and not really active in trying to spread their faith in general, but the Christians were spreading their faith and evangelizing. This was a threat to the Romans, because if the Christians, who had this exemption to not have to worship the Roman emperor, if they continue to spread their ideas and then other people across the empire get this same exemption, or it's going to cause others to riot, that'd be a problem. So the Romans start to notice that they refuse to burn incense to worship Caesar, and they're actively evangelizing, actively spreading their gospel, so it came to be a bigger and bigger problem. But with the first persecutions that start to happen, the first persecutions of the Christians are by the Emperor Nero in the mid-60s. This isn't primarily done because of the Christian faith. What happens is that Nero, he wants to expand his palace and his property. He wants to build a bigger palace in Rome, but a lot of the Roman citizens have houses in this area where he wants to expand. And so what Nero does is he sets the city on fire to burn down these houses to clear out the space so that he can expand his palace. But he doesn't want the people to know that he's the one who's responsible for the fire. So Nero basically says, well, the Jews don't like the Christians, the Romans don't like the Christians, I don't like the Christians, so let's just blame the Christians for this. They're an easy scapegoat. And there was a senator and historian at the time named Tacitus, and he writes about this, how Nero blamed the Christians for this fire, and then as a result, he has the Christians arrested so that he can punish them for this fire that they started. And so there's going to be this short but very severe persecution of the Christians. It's only in Rome, and Peter and Paul are two of those who are martyrs during this persecution. So in the mid-60s, we start to see a short-lived but very severe persecution of the Christians by Nero. But what will happen after this time is that they're going to then make Christianity illegal. And from this point on until after the year 300, Christianity will be illegal in the Roman Empire. It's illegal to be Christian. And then we'll continue to see persecutions over the next 250 years. But what will happen is these persecutions aren't constant and continuous. There's waves of persecutions that will happen, and it won't always be uniform across the empire. Some will just simply be in certain locations, and then others will be more widespread, depending on the time and the emperor. And then we'll also see over time there'll be increasing more and more laws against Christians to try to continue to dissuade people from converting to Christianity. And we'll talk about those laws. What will also happen is that the emperors, as well as the Roman people, are going to start to persecute the Christians because of their beliefs, because the Roman emperors start to see that these Christians will not compromise. They refuse to worship the emperor. They refuse to worship the Roman gods. They refuse to make any compromise to the faith and beliefs that they have, and this upsets many of the emperors, some more than others, but it makes the emperors start to become very angry. So they do start to persecute them because they're Christian at this point. And because their doctrines are often misunderstood, that only kind of makes things worse. So at this point in time, the Christians are accused of being cannibals because people understand that they're eating body and blood of someone, but they don't understand that it's the Eucharist, and so they're accused of being cannibals. The Christians are also accused of stealing babies and eating them, or of killing them, because what would happen is you would have babies who are abandoned at dumpsters and other places, and the Christians would go and save them and take the children and protect them and raise them and care for them. But then the Romans heard that people were experienced baptism, which is when you would die and then rise again to new life, and so they took it literally that we were killing babies and killing people through this idea of baptism. And they also thought that we were practicing incest because they said they would marry their brothers and sisters, when really it was just Christians had that name for each other, but it wasn't that we were marrying our blood brothers and sisters. It was just that's how we referred to each other, our brothers and sisters in Christ. So over time, the Romans start to completely misunderstand many of the Christian teachings and beliefs, and so they do start to persecute them more and more. Even Nero hated the practices of the Christians, because he even was said to have seen that the Christians were, he hated the Christians. He just felt like that they were a threat to humanity because of the beliefs that they held, because he misunderstood what it was they were actually teaching. And then we'll see in a little bit later, one of the early church fathers will even write to the emperor. Justin Martyr will write to the emperor, Marcus Aurelius, to try to help him understand the Christian teaching, because they have it so misunderstood. But the next time period of persecutions we're going to briefly talk about is Trajan. And we're going to talk about just a few emperors. We can't talk about them all, but a few of the more notorious emperors who persecuted the Christians. So Trajan reigned from 97 to 117 AD. During this time, it was illegal to be Christian. It was illegal to publicly practice Christianity, and it was punishable by death, but the Christians were not actively sought out. He didn't seek them out. He wasn't trying to hunt them down. And there are documentations of some of his governors writing to the emperor to ask how it was they were supposed to handle these Christians. And he said that, they needed to be aware there are many false accusations against the Christians, so if they were going to punish the Christians, they needed to make sure they investigated the cases. And then he also even said, make sure you let them recant. Give them many, many chances to recant. Because ultimately, Trajan wasn't really interested in eliminating them or hunting them down. But what happens is that at the end of Trajan's reign, there's an earthquake in Antioch, in the city of Antioch. And it happened that Trajan was there, and many people were killed, and Trajan himself was injured by this earthquake. And Trajan blames the Christians. And because of this, he does order a brief and very severe persecution of the Christians. And one of the victims of this was Ignatius of Antioch. And he lived around 107 AD. He starts to write letters. And this is when he's traveling on his way to Rome to be killed, to be martyred. And he'll end up being killed in the amphitheater with the animals. But Trajan will order that because he does order the execution of several Christians because of this earthquake. Marcus Aurelius is the next time frame from 161 to 180, who also severely persecutes the Christians. He was a very wise and prudent man. He was a great philosopher. His times of persecution were very intense. He persecuted the Christians systematically and strategically. He did not like the Christians. He found them intolerable, and he just couldn't could not understand why it was they would not compromise. They were so zealous, and they promoted living their way of life and wouldn't compromise to anything else. Several of the martyrs during his time were many bishops, and also particularly Justin Martyr. And Justin Martyr did write him some letters to try to help him understand the faith, but ultimately Justin Martyr was killed. There were several others who were notorious for persecuting Christians. So Septimus Severus, so Perpetua and Felicity during this time, Decius, and then Valerian are also well known. And Valerian during this time was Deacon Lawrence, who has a famous story about how he was killed. And then Tarsius was a young boy who was killed while he was trying to take the consecrated host to another group of people, and so he's I think he's the saint for altar boys, but so he was a young boy killed during this time. But these three they were notorious as well for persecuting Christians during their reign. And then up to this point, up until the year 300 that we're coming to, more and more laws will have been made to try to dissuade people from being Christian. So it became illegal to convert to Christianity. All church property was confiscated. You could have no public assembly. Initially, there was a time where they made it illegal to be a priest or a bishop, but then the emperors found this really didn't work. People continued to be priests and bishops, so then they ordered all priests and bishops to be killed, and then people realized they still continued. As soon as they would kill a priest and a bishop, other ones would rise up and take their place. That really wasn't working. So sometimes during these waves of persecution, you would see these laws being changed and worsened to try to find ways to discourage people from being Christian and try to, in many ways, eliminate Christianity. It just never worked. One of the worst, most severe persecutions was under Diocletian at the end of the 3rd century. And so Diocletian, what he will do is he's going to actively seek out the Christians. He's going to hunt them down. He puts bounties on their head to try to encourage people and governors to hand them over. And so during his time, you're going to see many who die for the faith, including St. George and Sebastian, who are both Roman soldiers who converted. And then you'll have others, Agnes, Catherine of Alexandria, Lucy, and many others. So the most severe persecutions occur under Diocletian. And then the other thing is during the first 300 years, the first 33 popes were also martyred for the faith. And so the key thing with this is just recognizing that it wasn't one continuous 250-year period of persecutions. It was waves of persecutions, but at every moment it was illegal to be Christian, so at any moment their lives could be threatened, they could be persecuted, so it was still very difficult to be a Christian. It was a difficult time, but some periods of time were relatively more peaceful than others, but it was illegal throughout this time to be Christian. But what we see is that even though the Romans were trying to do everything that they could to eliminate Christianity, it only continued to grow, and Christianity continued to spread and gain many converts. And so many historians have looked back to try to see why it is that Christianity spread. Why was this? And one of the characteristics was their charity. They loved without distinction. They loved and respected all people, and they witnessed this in the lives they led. And a particular example of this love is during the outbreak of plagues. During this time, there were plagues that would happen in different parts of the empire, and often what would happen is if a city or a town had the plague, then many people who were not infected would abandon the city, and they would leave, even if it meant leaving family members and friends behind. They would leave the city and just leave the sick. But the Christians wouldn't leave. They wouldn't abandon the sick. They would stay behind, whether they knew the person or not. They stayed back and would even care for strangers because they held every human life as sacred and wanted to care for them and protect them. And so at times this meant that Christians would also become sick as well and die, but other times Christians were able to help care for them and nurture them back to good health, so that sometimes these people did survive. But this was an amazing witness, and many people, as a result, converted to Christianity. There's even letters from some of the pagans who talk about how they could not believe that Christians would do this, that Christians would stay back and care for strangers. They would care for people whose own family and friends had abandoned them, yet the Christians would stay back and help. And in some cases, these are people who had even persecuted the Christians, but the Christians helped them nonetheless. And so there were many who converted because of this great witness. They also did not fear death. So by them staying back and helping through these sick times, and also by them dying for their faith, they saw that they did not fear death. This was really attractive because to the pagans at the time, to the Greco-Roman people, they didn't have this. They did fear death. They didn't know what would happen in life after death, or if there even was life after death. But these Christians had such great hope and joy despite suffering, and despite even during the times of being martyred, they were always filled with joy, and this was moving. They had a remarkable love for God, and the martyrs who died for their faith demonstrated this the most clearly, because the pagans would look and say, who would have such faith that they'd be willing to give up everything for it, even their own lives? And so the martyrs were viewed with amazement that people would be willing to die for love of God, when they could simply just recant and just simply say, well, I'll reject my God so that I don't die. The martyrs refused to do that. They refused to deny God. They preferred to die. And this was just amazing. This was unheard of. Their social teaching was also very attractive to many, especially the women and the slaves. But to women, they saw a lot of what the church taught very attractive compared to the way they were treated in the Greco-Roman culture. And then Christians also evangelized family and friends. And so this was another important reason as to why it is that Christianity spread in the early church, is because people were evangelizing family and friends constantly, as often as possible. And not only that, they would evangelize anyone. They would go out and preach to anyone who would listen. We can see that with St. Paul, but they definitely evangelized to family and friends. And so this is why we can see Tertullian says that the blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church, because we can see that even during this time of great persecution and great suffering, the church actually grows and spreads because of the witness of the lives of these early Christians. So that's going to bring us to the Patristic age. And in these last few minutes, before we'll take a break, we're going to just start here briefly at the beginning of the Patristic age. And this starts with a man named Constantine. And what's going to happen is that at the beginning of this 4th century, you're going to have the emperor, the Roman Empire, who Diocletian, at the beginning of this century, is the emperor. And to help him govern, because it's such a wide, vast territory, he's going to have other men who help him to rule. And so he'll have one leader in the west, whose name is Constantius, and he's the emperor of the western part of the empire. And his son is Constantine. And after Constantius dies, then Constantine makes a claim to be the emperor of the West. But another man named Maxentius also wants to be the emperor in the West. And so what will happen, just to be very brief about this event, is there's going to be a battle, the Battle of the Milvian Bridge, and Constantine is going to win and defeat Maxentius, and then he will become the emperor of the western part of the empire. But Constantine will credit his victory to the Christian God. Now, Constantine was not Christian, but he had a vision the night before this battle, and he saw a vision in the sky of a cross, and he believed that it was the Christian God telling him that he would be victorious. And so when he went into battle the next day, he had all of his soldiers have a cross on their shield, and he felt the God of the Christians was with him. So when he won, he attributed this to the God of the Christians. Now, this did not make him convert, but he was very sympathetic to the Christians, and so he himself started to show a lot of favoritism to the Christian people, though he did not convert at this point. And so what will happen is that Constantine, the emperor in the west, will join with the emperor in the east, Licentius, and they will make the Edict of Milan. So in 313, they're going to put out this edict, and this edict does not make Christianity the official religion of the empire, but it simply says that all religions are tolerated. So it really did not matter what religion you practiced. Everything was tolerated. So it would end the persecution of the Christians. Constantine also returns all of the confiscated property to the Christians. He makes laws that are favorable to the Christians and to the church. He will outlaw crucifixion. He will stop the gladiatorial games. He makes Sunday a legal holiday where the government offices were closed. He makes strict laws against abortion. He makes the church exempt from taxes. And then Constantine and his mother, St. Helen, will also preserve many Christian holy places, especially in the Holy Land. And they'll also build the first St. Peter's Basilica. And so there are many good things that Constantine brings to the church, but it's not all good, because he's also very ambitious. Everything he does is really is for his own success at the end of the day, and this is really what drives his decisions, is his ambition. And so even though he does some good things for the church, he also will interfere greatly with the church, and he'll interfere too much in many ways. And he's also not a moral person during this part of his life. He does a lot of immoral things, including killing his son and his wife, as well as other people. So he's not a model in any way of how to live, but he was driven by his ambitions, driven by this desire for power and success. This is just an image of the map of the Roman Empire during the time of Constantine. And what will also happen is Constantine, the Rome was the capital of the empire, but during the time of Constantine, he's going to move the capital to a city called Byzantium, and then he'll change the name to Constantinople, and then that will become the capital of the empire, the Roman Empire, from that point on. And Constantine does not transform the Roman culture by any way. As I said, he shows some favoritism to the church, makes Christianity legal, or makes it legal and they're not persecuted, but the culture is still problematic. There's still unbridled pursuit of wealth, and there's still a lot of immorality happening. St. Augustine will live during the end of this century, and he'll write about the situation, and he'll discuss, this is in the end of the 4th century, he'll discuss how the majority of the Roman Empire doesn't seem to be bothered by all the corruption and immorality that exists. And he says that he blames it on the fact that the empire provides people with material prosperity, and they're victorious in war, and this is why people just tolerate the immorality. And so Augustine will get upset, and he'll write about how Rome is an example of the greatest civilization, yet we're spiritually impoverished. And so he's going to write about how spiritually impoverished the empire is in his book, The City of God, at the end of this 4th century. So Constantine doesn't make the empire Christian. He makes it not persecuted. He's not transforming the culture at this point, but he is allowing Christianity to now be publicly expressed. During this age, we also are going to see a rise in heresies. Now, because the Christians are now permitted to express their faith publicly, they now can also have a lot more theological discussions. And so you're going to start to see people having discussions, but also people starting to develop their own interpretations of Revelation, take tradition and Scripture and interpret it in their own way, separate from the way that some of the leaders in the church were interpreting. And so you start to see these divisions that'll start to develop. These will be called heresies. And some of these heresies are Gnosticism. This had been around for a while, even before the 300s, but you're going to continue to see the influence of Gnosticism. You'll see Arianism, which is one of the great heresies of the time, and then Montanism, Manichaeism, and others. Arianism is probably one of the biggest. This is going to have great influence across the empire. It's going to impact the church significantly. This was begun by a man named Arius in Alexandria, Egypt, and he's going to teach that God is wholly transcendent and indivisible, but that Jesus is not equal to God, that Jesus is the first creature. He was a perfect creature, but he was a creature nonetheless, so he was not equal to God. And Arius will also teach the Holy Spirit was also a creature, and so not equal to God. So it's a rejection of this teaching of the Trinity. And his ideas will spread throughout the empire, have great influence over many, and even many of the bishops will even fall into Arianism for a time. And so with Arianism being a heresy, with these other heresies developing, the church is going to call various councils during this patristic age to address heresies. The first ecumenical council is going to be the Council of Nicaea in 325, and this particularly will address the Arian heresy, Arianism. And so they will meet and discuss these heresies that are existing, discuss these different teachings, and then they'll declare what it is that the church teaches and what the church has taught since the time of Christ. And so Athanasius will play a big role in this council. Some of the doctrines that the Council of Nicaea clearly defines will be those same things that we say every Sunday in the first half of the creed that we say. And then the continuing during this 4th century, you will also have the various heresies related to the Holy Spirit, saying the Holy Spirit was not God, again rejecting the idea of the Trinity. And in 381, you'll have the Council of Constantinople, and this will even clarify some teachings about the Holy Spirit. And then the combination of these two councils will give us the creed that we have today and that we say in Mass every Sunday, the Nicene-Constantinopolitan Creed. So we say that creed every week, and it's a combination of the doctrines that were clearly taught at these councils. But they're addressing various heresies that were developing and influencing the church. And over the next several centuries, even to the present century, we continue to see various heresies that begin to exist over time, and councils will intermittently be held to address these. And so we're not going to go over these heresies, but just to give you an idea, some of the different councils that were called over the next few centuries during this patristic age. So the Council of Carthage specifically addresses the Pelagian heresy, Council of Ephesus, the Nestorian heresy, Council of Chalcedon, the Monothelites, Council of Orange, Semi-Pelagian. So various councils will be held to address heresies. Some councils are going to be ecumenical, which are more or less worldwide, and then you'll also have local councils that will be held throughout this time. But because there's now the ability to assemble publicly, this is now possible. And then what will ultimately happen is during the end of the 4th century, because of the influence of Christianity among the people, and as well as the influence of Christianity among the emperors, you'll have Emperor Theodosius in 386, who will declare Christianity as the official religion of the Roman Empire. And so he's going to now make Christianity official, and it actually will become illegal to practice other faiths, particularly pagan worship of other gods is going to be illegal. And so now we see Christianity becoming the religion of the empire. This is going to bring some things that provide a lot of benefit to the church, but there's also going to be some new challenges that the church will face. And so we'll talk more about that after our break. All right, well, we will get back started. Sorry. It's all right.
Okay.
All right. So we left off kind of with the empire being declared Christian and in 386. The next significant thing that happens as the Christians are starting to transform the culture is there's a major problem that starts to come into play, and that's going to totally change the face of the empire. What's going to happen is now the barbarians have been a problem, even up to this point, even before this point, the barbarians. So the barbarians are a group of people who live outside of the Roman Empire, and they would often try to invade the Roman Empire for various reasons. Sometimes they just were attracted to the climate. Sometimes they were attracted to the idea of the wealth and economic prosperity of the empires. They would try to invade and be a part of that. Sometimes they were just pushed out of where they were currently living by enemies, by other barbarian tribes. And so you have the Huns, the Visigoths, the Ostrogoths, the Vandals, the Franks, large variety of barbarian groups that are a threat, a constant threat. And they've been a threat. And the emperors, up until this point, for several hundred years, had been trying to kind of protect the borders of the empire, trying to protect from these invasions, doing various things to try to preserve the empire from being invaded. The barbarians were brutal and they were pretty ruthless. Now, it wasn't necessarily that they were unique. I mean, the Romans themselves would do brutal and ruthless things also, but the barbarians were brutal and they were ruthless, and they continued to push for hundreds of years. The Roman Empire will make some mistakes because they're going to allow some of these tribes to enter into the empire peacefully, and that what's going to end up happening is they're going to actually revolt in many places and kind of have an uprising and attack the empire. But ultimately, you have a lot of different reasons why they end up being successful. Some will be allowed in and they'll revolt. Some will just continue to pound on the borders and eventually overrun the Roman soldiers. Ultimately, the key thing is that what's going to happen is there's a major battle in 378 in Adrianople where the barbarians are going to be successful. They're going to invade. You can see this mark on the map. So they're going to invade. One group of barbarians will invade that area, which is going to be a major, it definitely destroys, a lot of the Roman soldiers are killed in that battle, so it's a major impact. But then you have all the other threats throughout the empire, and then ultimately in the year 410, Rome would be sacked. This was devastating because for over 800 years, the capital of Rome had not been invaded, had not been sacked, had not been destroyed. It was kind of the this visible sign of peace and unity and stability and strength, this idea of Rome. So when Rome falls, it's a shock to everybody that this city, this great city of this great empire, has fallen. And even the Christians are going to be shocked. St. Jerome will write about how he cried. I mean, he had tears in his eyes because of this event, because to them, their whole world is being taken over, because Rome was the sign of peace and security and strength, and now it's been attacked. St. Augustine will write about it. All the Christians, all the pagans, everyone is really impacted by this invasion. So in 410, Rome is sacked, and then the barbarians will continue to be a threat. They'll continue to invade. All the different tribes will invade the empire. And then what's going to happen is in 476, the Roman Empire in the west comes to an end because it's all been invaded by the barbarians. So you have that western half is invaded now, and all the different barbarian tribes have taken over. So the Roman Empire in the west falls. And this is going to lead to great chaos, because you can imagine you have all these different barbarian tribes that are coming in. There's no longer this unity. There's no longer this stability. You have different tribes, different leaders who are taking over in different places. The whole social order is going to be disrupted. There's no united method of ruling. There's no one leader that they're all united under. And now they're fighting each other. All the tribes are fighting. The Roman people are fighting. It's just constant civil war. There's no structure. There's no organization. So the people are now going to especially turn to the one source of unity they know, the church. Because the church in this time of chaos is the one sign of unity that the people can see. And so St. Augustine will even recognize this, and he'll call the bishops and the Pope to really step up, because now the people really need you. They need you to help transform this culture and to help be an influence of hope and stability and unity, because right now the people are falling into despair because of all the chaos. St. Augustine will also talk about how one of the problems they're now going to face is they don't have one united ruler, and often the barbarians don't come in with a strong moral foundation. So if a society doesn't have a strong moral foundation from which come their laws, they're going to have a problem with seeing unjust laws that are going to start to come to play. And St. Augustine will emphasize that we can't let the state define what's right and what's wrong, because that's not true justice. There has to be something external that defines the moral laws, and the state will basically try to enforce those. And so St. Augustine really called for the bishops and the Pope to have a lot of influence during this time, because it was a time of just total upheaval, and the people really needed the church at this point. So again, just a reminder of what it looked like, and then you can see the kind of like the light tan is the barbarian territory, the kind of khaki color is the empire in the west, and then this darker tan is going to be the empire in the east. So here's Constantinople, it's the center. So here, that over there is going to be the Western Empire. This is going to be the East, and it will stay united for a time. And so we'll talk about this in just a second, but this is kind of the empire and what it's starting to look like. Christopher Dawson, the historian, he basically says this quote: The breakdown of the political organization of the Roman Empire left a great void which no barbarian king or general could fill. This void was filled by the church as teacher and lawgiver. The new barbarian kingdoms had taken over the military and political functions of the empire, but everything else belonged to the church. The moral authority, the learning, the culture, the prestige of the Roman name, and the care of the people. A man's real citizenship was not to be found in his subjection to the barbarian state, but in his membership of the church, and it was the bishop rather than the king that the man looked to as leader of the Christian society. So you start to see the bishops playing a significant role in society, more so than they had been called to do before, because of the chaos. And eventually, these barbarian tribes will be influenced by the church because she'll send out missionaries, but at first that's not the case. And at first, when these barbarians are invading, they're very ruthless. They would invade, oftentimes they would invade a city, pillage it, and then leave. And then it was left to the bishops to rebuild the city. And one of the things that the barbarians often did would be to attack the churches and the monasteries because there was great wealth there. They didn't recognize the sacred objects, so they would take them. The monasteries had wealth, they would take it, and then they would destroy the church and destroy the monastery. And then they also saw this church as this foreign institution. So they kind of resented it. So they resented the church and would destroy it, and then they also saw it as a source for wealth. So they would come into this town, destroy everything, and then leave, and then the bishops had to rebuild. The barbarians also, when they would invade, kind of disrupted agriculture, disrupted trade, disrupted economy. So a lot of things that had been in place from the Roman Empire were now kind of disrupted. And then the armies, the barbarians, the people were just living in absolute fear and despair because of what was happening. So the church is really called to help this culture. And then the thing that also even kind of makes this worse is during this time, there are also many outbreaks of plagues periodically throughout the empire, and that would devastate cities, and so you would have that also playing a role in addition to the barbarians. So it was a difficult time. So this is what will end up happening around the year 500. So you'll have the barbarian kingdoms, and then you have the eastern portion, which becomes the Roman Empire. So after the fall of the Roman Empire in the West, you're going to start to see increasing tensions between those in the West and those in the East. This will play a role politically, socially, and even in the church over time. Because even though the empire was now smaller, it was unified in the East and was under an emperor. There were many Christians that were in this eastern portion, and the eastern portion was also wealthier. The main thing the Western Empire now had, other than chaos, was it still had Rome and it still had the papacy. And so that really is still what made the church significant in the West, because of the papacy in Rome. And otherwise, a lot of Christians were in the East, a lot of influence comes from the East. But you're going to start to see building tension, because now the West is primarily these unevangelized barbaric tribes. There's political divisions between the East and the West, this chaotic West or this unified East. There's going to be different languages, and now it's going to be even more different. You have all these different cultures and languages in the West. The East is going to be unified in language. The cultures, you can imagine, all the different cultures that now exist in the West, the East is still this unified culture. And so you're going to start to see over the next centuries tension building between the East and the West. And economically, politically, socially, and in the church. And that's going to bring us almost to what's going to be called the Carolingian age. But before I really even get to the 650s, we have to talk briefly about something that's going to be an influence to this next age. And so Pope Gregory the Great is a very important figure. He's Pope from 590 to 604. And he influenced the church in many great ways. He brought unity and stability, was a great leader, great pope. Theologically, spiritually, he brought a lot to the church. And we can't even talk about the many great things he did. The one thing I want to focus on that he really helped with was his focus on monasticism. Because monasticism is going to be very, very important to the church and very important to the culture. Gregory the Great, he wanted to be a monk but instead he ends up being made Pope. But as Pope, he utilizes the gift of the monks and sends them out to evangelize. And the monks are going to be a critical source for evangelization and transformation of the culture, both during this time period and beyond. And so before we get to the Carolingian age with the 650s, I want to stop and talk about monasticism, because we have to see the role it played and look at its origins, and then it's going to have a great impact on the church and the culture. So we're going to kind of digress for just a minute and talk about monasticism. So monasticism has two general types, the Hermetical and the Cenobitic. So the Hermetical is the first type, and this is the type that you first see coming into existence in the early 300s. These were the original monks. The first were in Egypt. St. Anthony of Egypt is going to be the model of this form of monasticism. And they generally would live in the desert or some type of really secluded place. But they were radically committed to God. Oftentimes they saw the worldliness of the cities, and they wanted to radically withdraw from that. And so they wanted to just commit their whole lives to serving God in a radical way. And so they would often go into the desert and be isolated. They'd pray intensely for the whole human race, and they would fight many spiritual battles, intense spiritual battles. You can read the life of St. Anthony of Egypt, and it's incredibly powerful. I'd encourage you to read it. It's not a very long book, but you'll read some of the things that happened to him that he encountered while he was fighting these spiritual battles. But ultimately what ends up happening is this becomes a radical source of evangelization, because people see these men giving up everything to live for God. And so people look to them as models for life, models for the Christian life, how to live your faith. Now, not everyone then becomes a hermetical monk, but people start to see that this life isn't of utmost importance, it's the next life. And so they become great sources of evangelization. People will often even turn to them for spiritual counsel and guidance. These monks will often even fight heresy. And they'll sometimes come back into the city or to the area to fight heresy, and then kind of go back and forth at times. But this is the first type of monasticism, and it's going to be very popular and be a great influence on the culture of the time. So again, this is starting in the 300s. So right around the time that you start to see Christianity becoming legal, you're going to start to see this being practiced and starting to influence the culture. And then that will eventually lead to another type of monasticism, the Cenobitic or the communal type. And so this would be men who would choose to live celibate. They would live together, and they would live together and work and worship together in a communal life. There would also, around this time, start to become groups of women who would do the same thing. Pachomius was one of the first ones that's credited with this type around the 300s, the early 300s, and so he would gather men together in these communities, and then there would usually be some type of rule of how they would live and how their life was going to be ordered. Other important figures would be St. Basil in the East would do something similar. St. Martin of Tours would bring this into other parts of the West, and so you have this form of monasticism that also grows. It also becomes a great source of evangelization, again because they're showing this radical life oriented to God, giving up the normal things that come with life and turning towards God. St. Benedict of Norcia is a key figure with this type of monasticism. He actually initially began as a hermetical monk, but he was very well respected, so he eventually was asked to be the abbot of a monastery at Subiaco around 500 AD. And one of the things that he does, he's going to found several monasteries, and then he's going to have a lasting impact because he creates a rule of life that's going to become very popular, and it's called St. Benedict's Rule. And Pope Gregory the Great is going to push this over the centuries as people are needing reform. This is one of the rules of life that will continue to be an influence in monasticism. And basically his rule included a vow of poverty, chastity, and obedience, but also renouncing property, renouncing marriage, and that your focus is not on yourself and your will, it's on God's will. It's really to focus on love, the love of God, service to God. So his one of the phrases would be that his monastery, the monastic life, was a school for the service of the Lord. And that was really what they would focus on, is that their life was rooted in the gospel. They'd be this self-contained society, so they didn't need to rely on anything else, but they still would have a lot to offer to the world. But you start to see them learning and being very innovative. How can they do agriculture? How can they raise their own food? How can they help with education? So over time, over the centuries, you're going to see a lot of flourishing come from the monasteries. There'd be strict dietary rules. There'd be regular, ordered ways of how you live your life. And then you would pray together, and then you would work. Hospitality was an important thing. They would always be hospitable to anybody. They would give shelter and food and clothing to whoever needed it. They weren't really, their vision wasn't poverty, but it was simplicity. And then the rules that they had wasn't just to have rules. It was to help them be ordered to one thing. And that one thing was love of God and salvation of souls. So everything that you did was to lead you to God, to help order you to deepening your own experience with God. And then they would pray for the salvation of souls. And so even though these were enclosed communities, they had become a center of culture, because you can imagine, as we were just talking about the period of time, there's all this chaos and disorganization. You can look to these men or these women living in these communities, showing this radical orientation to God, and it would help the people see peace and unity and stability. The monks would become eventually sources of education, ways to help teach people how to do their own agriculture. They'll help with economy and trade. They're going to have a great influence on the culture as a whole, not only especially spiritually, but also just in the way that people live their life. And then Pope Gregory the Great, when he comes into the papacy, into his pontificate, he's going to send monks and really make a point to send them out to evangelize and go into these various barbarian territories to be this sign of a radical commitment to God. And so even without words, these people could just live their life and show these barbarians that there's a greater calling that we all have. And then over time, these missionaries will have significant influence on the barbarians and convert many of them to the Christian faith. So monastic life was very countercultural, and they would preach that the more you live your life the way God calls you to live, no matter how crazy the world thinks, the more effective that you'll be as an evangelist. So live how God calls you to live, and then you'll be able to be an even more powerful evangelist. Because the real power of the gospel is the gospel that's lived. And so that's what they were a sign of. So they became a very, very significant influence. And so it's important to kind of see their role. They'll rise up in the 300s, but when Pope Gregory the Great becomes Pope, he's going to really send them out, and then we're going to continue to see their influence throughout the rest of history. And so the monks show the sign that the next life is more important than this one. They're models of humility, obedience, charity. They'll become a source for various resources. We'll talk about this more in a little bit, but one of the important things they'll also do is preserve texts. They'll preserve the Bible, and then they'll also preserve ancient classical texts, Plato and Aristotle and Cicero, all these Greco-Roman classic texts. They'll help preserve them. And we'll talk about some of their innovation probably on Wednesday. And then they were a great source of evangelization. So that was briefly about the monks, and like I said, they'll continue to come back into our history over the next several centuries up until the present day. And so now we're going to jump into the Carolingian age, and we're going to jump to 700 AD. There's a few things that we're skipping that are important that we're going to come back to. Some of the things that happen with different invasions, but for right now we're going to jump to 700 AD because this is a significant event. In 700 AD, there's a man named Charles Martel. He's also called the Hammer. And so this is going to be happening in the Frankish kingdom. And so this is present-day France area, basically. And one of the problems are the Muslims. And we're going to come back and talk about the Muslims later. But the Muslims are rising to power. They're being very aggressive. They're invading a lot of territory. And currently, at this period of time, they're in what's present-day Spain. They're trying to get into France. And it's a significant thing because if they had been able to invade France, they would have had access to a much greater portion of Europe. But what Charles Martel does is he's able to stop the advance of the Muslims. It's a significant military battle that really stops the invasion of the Muslims. They stay in Spain, and they're going to be in Spain for about 700 years, continuing to fight, trying to invade before their invasions are stopped. But Charles Martel will be a great leader, very important battle that will happen. And during this time, Charles Martel, who, as I said, is a leader in the Frankish kingdom, the Franks were a barbarian tribe, he's going to establish a great relationship with the papacy. Because what they're going to start to recognize is the popes need protection as well, as do the churches. And so if the popes can build a relationship with some of these military leaders or some of these barbarian kingdoms, they can kind of help each other. The papacy can kind of help support that leader locally or throughout the empire, and then that leader can in return help to protect the pope with military power, helping protect local churches as well as the pope in Rome. And so they're going to start to build relationships. And it starts with Charles Martel somewhat, but it's going to get even greater with some of his relatives. So Charles Martel will start this relationship with the papacy, and then he's going to, after he dies, his two sons, Carloman and Pepin, are going to be given the kingdom, the Frankish kingdom. It'll be divided between the two of them. Well, soon after this happens, Carloman actually retires into monastic life, and so then Pepin becomes the sole ruler of the Frankish kingdom. And both these sons were very loyal to the church and to the pope. They were very religious. And so Pepin, whenever he becomes the sole ruler, he vows to protect Rome and the papacy and to help protect the church in any way possible. And ultimately what will happen is that he'll be crowned, symbolically he'll be coronated by the pope, just to kind of be a sign of this relationship. And then Pepin will acknowledge that I have temporal authority, but the pope has spiritual authority, and if we can work together in harmony, we can help to transform the culture and build unity, build stability, build peace. So Pepin had this in mind. Pepin also gave the Pope some land, some additional land, that'll eventually be called the Papal States. So eventually what was called the Papal States was given to the Pope by Pepin, just as a sign of this relationship. And then I'm going to have to, a lot of this I can't go into too much detail just for time's sake, but what will happen is Pepin will die, and then he'll give the kingdom to his two sons, Charles and Carloman. Carloman will die unexpectedly, fairly quickly after this happens, so that Charles becomes the sole ruler. And Charles is also who we know as Charlemagne. So Charles the Great is Charlemagne. And so Charlemagne is a very important figure. What will happen is that Charlemagne continues to be loyal to the Pope. He continues to protect the papacy and the church. The popes are going to continue to be threatened. There's many groups who are invading Rome, barbarian groups and various local rivalries and families. There's all kinds of things happening civilly in all the different communities, and so there's a lot of fighting. At one point, Pope Leo III is even attacked and beaten in the streets of Rome, and so he calls to Charlemagne for help. And Charlemagne comes into Rome, and he vanquishes the enemy. And then as a result, Pope Leo III will go to France, and he will crown Charlemagne in 800 AD the Holy Roman Emperor. So he basically saying, I'm recognizing you as the emperor, the Roman Emperor, and you're holy because of our relationships. This Holy Roman Empire is established because of this. And Charlemagne was a skilled military leader, great strategist, but he's also very ruthless. I mean, he was very faithful to the papacy, but there were times where he ignored church teaching because of his own interests and things that he was trying to pursue. But he did build up an effective centralized administration. He would travel a lot. This is kind of the territory that now Charlemagne has inherited as well as invaded to take over. So he has kind of expanded the empire as to what it was. So everything in green is kind of what he's partially inherited, as well as some of it he has conquered himself in expansion of the empire. You can see the little yellow papal states from Pepin. And so Charlemagne is now trying to unify this once chaotic western part of the empire. And there is a lot that he's effective with. As I said, his administration, the centralized administration, is helpful. He'll travel throughout the territory to help maintain peace. He was also a very zealous defender of Christianity. He promoted it, but the problem was at times when he would conquer territories, he would also force conversions. And the church definitely said this is wrong. You should never do this. You can't coerce people to be Catholic, but so they would kind of condemn these actions, but he would do it anyway just because he was so zealous about his faith. And so the church definitely looks negatively on that. He also, like many Christian emperors, involves himself too much in church matters, so sometimes he would try to do too much with church affairs, which becomes a problem. But there's a lot of things that happen and that are great about his reign. He didn't reign for very long. He dies in 814, but even though he didn't reign for a really long time, there's a lot of things he did throughout his reign. He revolutionized literacy and education. So he really starts to build up education, literacy. He also helps to impact the language and writing itself. He encourages schools for people, lay people and clergy, both what are called like monastic schools at monasteries, as well as cathedral schools. So if you had a cathedral, he would encourage schools to be there. So he really tried to build up education for everyone. Through the influence of his court, he kind of really established the foundations of what would later be medieval learning, that'd be called later liberal arts. So he really promoted this idea of studying logic and grammar and rhetoric and arithmetic, geometry, a wide range of things. So he really promoted education. He also improved trade and communication. So there's a lot of great things that come from him and his influence. And so even though it was short-lived, the culture really was enduring a lot of what he offered and brought to the culture. Unfortunately, though, as great as his short reign was, his son, Louis the Pious, inherited the kingdom, and he was very weak. He wasn't very strong. He was still crowned Holy Roman Emperor, but he really wasn't a very strong leader. So we start to already see some problems developing. But then it gets worse when Louis the Pious dies, because then he has sons who the kingdom is divided among the sons, and civil war breaks out over who has what territory, and then all wanting to grasp more and more territory. So you have civil war that breaks out. So this great unification that happened under Charlemagne is now once again in disunity and chaos. And so from this point on, that part of the empire is not going to be united ever again. So everything they had kind of worked for this harmony is now becoming a problem at this point after his grandsons divided the empire. So one of the things that we also have to kind of recognize that's now going to start to happen is for a while, for many decades, there was a great, from 700 until about the middle of the 800s, middle of the 9th century, there is this acknowledgement of the temporal authority and spiritual authority working together in harmony. And so this was good for unity. People also held their leaders accountable. So a king who was acting in ways that were contrary to the church would be seen as a tyrant at times, because they're not being faithful to that harmony that exists between the temporal and spiritual authority. And the kings would often look to the church for guidance if they were living in accord to this harmony. So there were some good things that started to happen. But then whenever you have this civil war and this disunity that now comes to play again, the kings are going to lose their influence. And so what's going to start to happen is if you have local leaders, dukes and nobles and lords, the powerful and wealthy in these local communities start to rise to power and have a lot of influence over the secular authority as well as the church. And so you're going to start to see chaos in all areas of life because of all this disunity that now is again coming into play. And we're going to come back and talk about some of these local leaders and their impact. But we also have to start to recognize another problem. So we see a huge increase in invasions again. So without a military unification, without a great military leader like Charlemagne, these invasions are going to start to happen more frequently again. So in the 9th and 10th centuries, you see a rise in these invasions. So the Muslims have been a constant threat since the 630s. We're going to come back and talk about them, but since around 630, they've been a constant threat. But now we also have the Vikings and the Magyars who start coming into play. They're just some other barbarian tribes that are going to be constantly threatening invasion, and they will invade some places. So this is a little map. The purple are the Vikings in just all the different areas that they're trying to attack and invade. The green are the Magyars. They're just the centralized group of barbarians in the central part of that area. They'll attack and have some severe attacks, but they'll eventually settle down in Hungary. And then the orange are the Muslims. With the Vikings, they're very brutal. They're going to basically attack many different areas. They're going to especially target monasteries because they see that they're great sources of wealth, so they'll ravish them, destroy them. They're going to attack Ireland and France and Russia, Iceland, Greenland, many places. They even attack France, and what will end up happening is the king of France, the Frankish king, he will offer an agreement. He'll say, well, if you'll convert to Christianity, I'll give you Normandy. So they agree to that. And so the Vikings in some areas become Christian, but it's very superficial. I mean, it doesn't really stop their attacks on the church. They still continue to attack the monasteries. And so the Vikings are very aggressive and invading a lot of places. Then you see the Magyars and then the Muslims. So the Muslims, I'm only going to briefly touch on them, but at this point, the 700s to 1000s, they're rapidly advancing. So within the first 100 years, they're already taking many, many lands because they're basically, it's death by the sword. They'll go into places and you either convert or you're killed, or if you don't convert and they happen to not kill you, you're treated as a second-class citizen. And so they're very aggressive. They're going to take over North America, or North Africa, hopefully that's not prophecy. North Africa, Spain, Palestine, Italy. They'll threaten Constantinople. They'll constantly be threatening Constantinople, constantly threatening France. And so they're going to continuously be a threat. And when they go into places, they will destroy churches many times. Christians are often killed or at least treated very poorly as second-class citizens. And we're going to come back and talk with them and their effect on the church here at a later time. But the Muslims are definitely a constant threat. The Vikings are now a threat. The Magyars are a threat. And now you also have social, political, economic disunity because you now have these kings fighting over who is going to be in charge and who it is that's your secular ruler. And so there's a lot of confusion and chaos. And so again, what's going to happen is that the bishops now again, the bishops and the Pope, become a source of unity. So you're going to have this disunity and instability economically and politically. These invaders are constantly threatening. These local nobles and dukes and lords have a lot of wealth and powers. They actually start to have more influence than even the king to some degree. And so the bishops and priests even will be looked to help bring unity. And what's going to develop is something called feudalism in the church, which, just to kind of be very brief with this, it's the idea where there's two parties who both need each other for something. So the church would offer support to a particular leader and say, we will support you and your rule if you will give us military protection or protect us with your armies and your weapons. And so the church needed protection, and so in return she would give the support to these local rulers, whichever rival family or rival duke that they would choose sides of. They would kind of choose sides and say, we'll give you our support from our local bishops and clergy and people if you'll give us your military protection. So they kind of, or various versions of that. So you'd have this feudalism that starts to develop. The other problem too that you'll begin to see is that the culture itself is no longer as Christian as it had been. The clergy are not always well educated. You'll see a drop in mass attendance, decrease in the reception of the sacraments. Church teaching and doctrine is not always taught. I mean, they preach about the glory of God. Like I read, this one historian was saying, if you read a lot of the sermons at this point, they preach about the glory of God, but they're not really emphasizing a lot of the church teachings because sometimes they weren't educated enough to do so. And why does that happen? What's happening to the clergy and the bishops? Well, one example is that if you have like this a wealthy local nobleman who decides that he kind of has control over this area because of his wealth and power, and he decides, I want a church here. He would invest his money, build a church. Then he would say, I want so-and-so to be the priest, and then because of his influence and power and wealth, he would influence the bishop to ordain this man who may not really be worthy or well-educated, and then he would become priest. And then sometimes because the local wealthy person would own the church, a lot of the tithing would go to that local wealthy person. It wasn't the same setup we have today where the monies would always go to the diocese. They sometimes would, but you also had some profit that could be obtained by having a church in your own local territory. But those local wealthy people could have influence over who was chosen priest and sometimes even who was chosen bishop. And so you start to see this influence of these local, powerful, wealthy families having more and more influence in the church and who is ordained priests and bishops. And then the papacy itself becomes less effective because you don't have a strong united kingdom, so the papacy is not well protected. There's constant invasions. These rival families are constantly fighting within Italy, within the city, and then within all local church communities. And the Pope can't communicate as well as they used to. Under Charlemagne, there was good communication, but now with all the disunity, disorganization, communication isn't as effective. And so anything the Pope would sometimes teach or preach couldn't always be promulgated as well. Even the bishops couldn't always promulgate what they're teaching as well to the people. And then because of the influence of these wealthy, powerful local families, you also have unworthy men chosen to be bishops and even Pope. And so this is unfortunate, but it's a reality of things that start to happen at this time because of the disunity that's happening. One example of an unworthy man who became Pope was there was a situation in Rome where there was this very wealthy noble, and he wanted to ensure that when he died, his son Octavian became Pope. So whatever he did worked, because once he died, he had so much influence and probably money and power that once he died, the next time an election came up for the Pope, his son Octavian was made Pope. And since Octavian really wasn't a fitting name for a Pope, he changed his name to John, and so he became John the 12th. John the 12th was in no way virtuous. He was very vile. He was accused of passing his whole life in vanity and adultery. At this time, the popes were living in the Lateran Palace. Constantine had given them this. It wasn't like it is today where they're in the Vatican. They're in the Lateran Palace, which is the Lateran Basilica. So that's where they lived. And so at this time, the Lateran Palace was given the reputation. It says the Lateran Palace where popes lived was spoken of as a brothel during his life because he was just very vile. He was not worthy of being Pope. Now, having said that, he's not the only example. There were others who were unworthy of being popes and even bishops. But what we can see during this time, as horrific as it is, that this is a reality, we can clearly see God keeps his promises. Because during this time of these unworthy men becoming Pope, Christ protected his church. Because not at any point during this time was there ever anything taught infallibly that was contrary to church teaching. There were no errors that were taught infallibly or by these popes. And so we know when Christ says that I will protect the church from the gates of hell and promise to protect her from error, that Christ did it. Because these men did not infallibly teach any doctrinal errors throughout their time as Pope. And so despite the immoral behavior of these men, the church survived and continues to survive even to this day. And so it's a tragic time, but we can see God's hand and the Holy Spirit protecting his church despite these things. And so this kind of leads us, you can kind of see where we're at right now, approaching the millennium, the year 1000. There's a lot of problems. There's disunity and there's economic trouble, political trouble. Sometimes the bishops can't even focus on religion and the church because they're so caught up in trying to help with the politics and the economy because they're so caught up in all this disunity and disorganization. So sometimes they fail to be good teachers because of their other distractions. So we see there's issues at all levels. Okay, and so we're approaching the year 1000. So at this time, all the chaos and immorality and corruption, it doesn't go unnoticed. Many people notice it. There are many calls for reform. We've got to reform the church. And so every level needs to be reformed. Even the monasteries had become corrupted. There were many monks who were not living faithful to their calling. They were being their focus was money and wealth, and they were even practicing immorality. So even at the level of the monks, there was a lot of corruption and problems, immorality. So at all levels, the laity, the monastery, the bishops, the priests, the popes, every level had some problems, and people were calling for reform. So around the year 1000, or approximately, we start to see really this call for reform starting to come into fruition in many ways. So we'll start, and it's going to take place in the next several centuries. It doesn't happen overnight that everything's changed, because things take time, but you will still start to see over the next few centuries, things will reform. And these next 300 years, from the year 1000 to the year 1300 into 1300s or so, it's a great time of flourishing. The year 1300, we're going to start to have a downfall again, a slide downwards. But for a couple hundred years, we are going to start to see this building as we reform, and then great flourishing, a time of flourishing because of these reforms. So let's start with the reforms in the monasteries. So there's one group of monasteries, the Cluny monasteries. They're in France. This is just one example. But they're going to start to recognize that there's a problem. The monastic life is very corrupt, because what had started to happen is the monks, because of their holiness and their austerity, attracted a lot of generous donations. So the monasteries became wealthy. Now the men, if they were ordered properly, weren't corrupted by this. But what started to happen is the men started to become corrupted. These monks started to become corrupted by some of this reality. The wealth started to corrupt the life. And so these monks in Cluny, France, they return to strict obedience to St. Benedict's rule. They start to establish various monasteries, and they're going to have one central monastery that's going to kind of oversee the others. They're going to try to bring a lot of stability, uniformity to the different monasteries. And there's more that can be said, but really just the key thing is they're going to recognize the problem and do things to change it. And it's going to be very influential. Over the next several hundred years, this practice of reform is going to spread to all the different monasteries that do exist, and then there's others that will start to arise. So the Camaldis, the Carthusians, the Cistercians, you'll have these new groups of monks that will also be established, in addition to the reform of those existing. Bernard of Clairvaux comes during this time period. He's one of the most important figures during this age, and so he's an example of someone who is a fruit of this, but he's going to be a great leader, great theologian, great preacher. He's going to help in this process. And really their key emphasis, just for time's sake, we just have to focus on their biggest emphasis, not only to preach the gospel, but to live it and to be countercultural. Everything that we talked about that made the monks so influential, they had kind of fallen away from. So now they're really trying to get back to their origins, to get back to what it is that made them such a great influence in the culture, in the world. So you start to see the reform of the monasteries. During these next several hundred years, you're also going to see the rise of religious orders, the formation of religious orders. Now, these are different than the monasteries and the monks, and we'll talk about it. But this is almost in response to some of the things that are happening. The religious orders will form. And let me see. So these are different than monks. So they sometimes live a similar lifestyle, sometimes a communal lifestyle, but they have what are called like apostolic charisms. So just to kind of show the difference. So the Franciscans, very common, one of the most popular groups of religious orders. They were established during this time. This is all happening around the 1200s. And so St. Francis of Assisi will create this new order. He calls them the Orders of the Friars Minor. They'll eventually be called the Franciscans. But their charism is preaching. So that's kind of really what they feel that they're called to do, is preaching. And then St. Francis himself, he was initially a hermit, but then he started to feel this call to really reform society, to preach a radical message of giving everything to God, complete faith in God and His providence, so he'll found this order. And then another popular order at the same time was the Dominicans. So St. Dominic, he was a priest. He felt a call to preach against heresy and to combat heresy, not only through words, but by the example of life, particularly the life of poverty. So Dominic founds the group that he calls the Order of Preachers. They'd eventually be called the Dominicans. But their charism was teaching. So these religious orders have a particular charism that they'll live as the focus of their life. And so, like the Dominicans and the Franciscans, they saw their men, their communities of men, but they were called friars, not monks, because they saw that they had, even though they were living in something similar to monasteries with a lot of discipline, they were more devoted to pastoral work instead of to the ascetic life. So monks were really committed to the ascetic life, working and praying, whereas the friars had this pastoral focus. And so you see the formation of religious orders. So the Franciscans, Dominicans, you'll see others during this time, Carmelites, the Poor Clares, Order of the Servants of Mary, and there's many others that'll form. The Franciscans are the most popular, and within the first 100 years, they'll get 30,000 members. So his order forms very quickly, but a lot of it's because of the culture that's transforming during this time as well. The papacy will also reform during this time. There's a call for reform there. As we mentioned, there was a lot of men who weren't worthy of being pope, but were elected. But again, the Holy Spirit protects the papacy and protects